This is an introduction to the Diencephalon. We're going to map out some of the broad information, anatomy and functions of the Diencephalon. Let's start with general stuff. The Diencephalon is the central core of the brain. It's located between the cerebral hemispheres and the brainstem. It's found in the area surrounding the third ventricle, and its structures actually form the boundaries of the ventricle itself. The diencephalon is formed of four major parts: the thalamus, the subthalamus, the epithalamus, and the hypothalamus. There's also a few other important structures that we'll come back to later. Next, we'll take a look at the gross features and boundaries. The superior surface of the diencephalon is concealed by the fornix, and the superior wall is formed by the roof of the third ventricle. The lateral surface is bounded by the internal capsule, which we can see more clearly in this image. Remember, the diencephalon has two symmetrical halves on either side of the third ventricle. The inferior surface is the only aspect of the diencephalon that is exposed. The rest is covered by other structures. Here is an inferior view of the brain where we can see the optic chiasm, the hypothalamus, and mammillary bodies. The medial surface is formed by the lateral wall of the third ventricle, which is bounded by the medial surfaces of the thalamus and hypothalamus. Now let's have a look at the four main structures we noted earlier. Let's start with the thalamus. The thalamus is the largest part of the diencephalon. It's an ovoid mass, which we can clearly see here in this cross-section drawing. There is one thalamus on either side of the third ventricle, which are bounded laterally by the internal capsule, as we mentioned before. The interthalamic connection, or adhesion, is a grey matter bundle that connects the left and right thalamus. In broad terms, the thalamus acts as an integration and relay station. It receives all type of sensory input, except for olfaction, and also motor input from the basal ganglia. This input is then sent on to the cortex and other subcortical regions. Here we can see a schema of the thalamus with its orientation. Each thalamus has several nuclei, but we won't go into detail here. Now let's move on to the subthalamus. As its name suggests, the subthalamus is located below or inferior to the thalamus, as we are highlighting in this image. It's much smaller than the thalamus and has the shape of a biconvex lens. Here's a picture for reference. The subthalamus is a complex structure. It contains the cranial ends of the red nucleus and the substantia nigra and has very important connections with the corpus striatum and globus pallidus. It forms part of the indirect pathway with the basal ganglia and thus is involved in the control and initiation of motor activity. There are some tracts which pass through the subthalamus on their way to other structures, such as the medial and trigeminal lemniscus. It's also worth noting that the extent of the exact function of the subthalamus in humans is not known. Now we'll take a look at the epithalamus. Here's an image that shows the epithalamus, which lies dorsal to the thalamus. The epithalamus connects the limbic system with the diencephalon. It contains some specific structures that we'll look at now. The habenular nuclei and its commissure lie at the posterior end of the epithalamus. The medial and lateral habenular nuclei form what is known as the habenular trigone, which lies just anteriorly to the superior colliculus. These nuclei are believed to play a role in the psychosocial behavioral responses to olfactory stimulus. They also play a role in sleep regulation and other broader emotional behaviors. And dysfunction of the habenular nuclei has been shown to cause psychosis. Another structure of the epithalamus is the pineal gland, which is attached to the pineal stalk. It can be found between the posterior aspect of the thalamus and is a pine cone-shaped structure. The pineal gland contains no nerve endings because it's actually an endocrine gland. It secretes melatonin, which regulates the sleep-wake cycles and circadian rhythm. Next, we move on to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is in the ventral portion of the diencephalon, as shown here in purple. It lies anteriorly and inferiorly to the thalamus. It forms the floor of the third ventricle, as we can see in this image. The hypothalamus has many nuclei, which we won't delve into, but they are grouped into the anterior, tuberal, and posterior divisions. The posterior aspect of the hypothalamus merges into the tegmentum of the midbrain. The hypothalamus has many functions, too many to list here, but they include regulation of the autonomic nervous system, the release of hypothalamic hormones, some of which stimulate the pituitary gland, regulation of hunger and feeding, control of water balance in the body, thermoregulation, and many more. Now all that's left is to briefly look at the other structures that we mentioned earlier. These are the optic chiasm, mammillary bodies, and the pituitary gland. First, the optic chiasm. The optic chiasm is found on the inferior aspect of the diencephalon. Anatomically, it's related to the hypothalamus and it's considered part of it. Functionally, it relates to the thalamus as input from cranial nerve 2 projects to the lateral geniculate nucleus of the thalamus. Moving on to the mammillary bodies. They are located at the anterior end of the fornix and are shown here in blue. Anatomically, they are also related to the hypothalamus, but functionally, they are related to the limbic system. They are comprised of two nuclei, the medial and the lateral, and they also project to the thalamus. For their function, they are involved in contextual recollective memory. And finally, the pituitary gland. Here's a picture, and as the name suggests, the pituitary gland is part of the endocrine system. It's attached to the hypothalamus and has two parts. The adenohypophysis is located anteriorly and is found below the optic chiasm. It doesn't contain any neurotissue, so we won't discuss it here. The neurohypophysis is located posteriorly and is comprised of neurotissue from the hypothalamus. It secretes two hormones, oxytocin, which is involved in social bonding and reproduction, and vasopressin, which is involved in vasodilation and water retention. And there we are. That was our introduction to the diencephalon.